Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's Bookstore, and I am joined today by a New Hampshire poet, Jennifer Militello. We are here in a pre-launch event for her newest volume of verse, The Pact, which is due to come out on May 1st, which I believe is Saturday. Is that right?
It is Saturday, yes.
So, and then last year, the pandemic kind of ate part of her previous book, Knockwood, a memoir and essays. So that is also available from Gibson's Bookstore. And then after this event, Jennifer is hosting a reception and book plate signing, I believe, in Zoom, and we will be putting the link into the chat sidebar for you. So make sure you save that link. If you are just signing in, please click around, find the chat sidebar, make sure your settings are set to all panelists and attendees so you can converse with each other and send Jennifer some well wishes on the pre-launch of The Pact. Jennifer, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. So I just want to start by saying hello to everyone and thank you so much for being here. This is a sort of pre-launch launch. So, you know, it's really exciting to have the book being in the world and coming out as an object. And I guess I would also just say, you know, Gibson's is an incredible place. It is one of the best independent bookstores in the world. I do believe this. It is not only a beautiful space, but it has the most amazing people. It has really incredible caffeinated beverages and also crepes. The crepes are really good. So if you are in the area, you should definitely go there as soon as you feel you can. And no matter what, thank you for being here and supporting this incredible bookstore, and they can always mail you some books if you are in the business for some. So I am going to talk a little bit about this new book, and it was mentioned that there will be a reception and a signing afterwards. So please, if you would like your book signed, I'm happy to mail you a signed book plate so you can come to the event that will be happening directly after this and say hello. The chat is wonderful, but it's always really nice to just be able to say hi as well. And so feel free to stop in. So I am just going to start with one very short piece from Knockwood, which was a little bit prematurely pandemicked as it came out. It had been out for a little while before things hit and everything closed down, but I did have to cancel a number of events before anyone knew what was happening that were supposed to happen. And it is kind of a partner book to the Pact. So I'm just going to read one very short, it is, as some of you know, a very sort of intricate and involved intertwining of three different stories, one of which is the sort of story of my mentally ill aunt who was in an abusive marriage and attempted suicide at some point. And then also the story of my boyfriend in high school who eventually died of a heroin overdose. And then the third thread is a love story sort of later on, closer to the present. And so these series of short essays in the book intertwine to tell these three stories in a slightly less traditional way. So I'm just going to read one of the short, the thread that holds these pieces together is the questioning of the nature of time and how coincidences work and how things are connected to one another, even though they seem to be happening in different periods of time. So I'm just going to read, there are several lyric essays that just touch on the theme of time and memory. I'll just read one very short one as a way of moving into the Pact and talking about the Pact and reading from it. So this is a piece called Invasive Species. And I mean, one of the things I realize more and more as I think about this book is that there are a series of trees and bushes that actually exist in my life, and many of them are in my yard. And this is one of the trees that is, bushes that is actually literally in my yard. So, invasive species. I don't want to remember. Memory is that bush in the yard that we keep cutting down as it keeps growing back. I don't know what species it is. It is the kind that has berries that you can't eat. Bird berries, my mother used to call them. Red and round and smooth. Now I tell my daughter, don't eat them, they'll make you sick. The fruit of memory, it makes you sick. You cut it flush with the ground and maybe burn where it has been. But slowly its stray, disordered branches clamber up and leaves form. And even before you realize it has begun to grow, it's a bush again, casting shadows, blocking your way down some narrow path, dominating the subtle slope that your yard takes on, the one that makes it good for sledding in winter. It will take over. It may grow thorns. It will govern in many directions at once. Each of those red berries a point of focus, a droplet of blood. If I'm lucky, the past is instead a bracelet with a broken clasp resting slackly on the wrist, soon to fall loose and be lost. And this leads into some pasts that maybe will happily be lost, and some that will hopefully be maintained. So the Pact, and I'm just going to hold it up because look, it's an object. It is out on Saturday. Its pub day is Saturday, so that's its book birthday in the world. And I'm so happy to be here to bring it into the world with Gibson's. So the Pact is a book about love, and it is a book about the complexities of love. So there are poems that are about family. There are poems that are about romantic love. And it's really a way of examining how love is not only a gift for us, but also often makes us, feel like we're struggling, or sometimes hurts us deeply, because sometimes the people we love hurt us deeply, and intentionally, unintentionally, no matter how it happens, our relationships are intense and they are complex. And so this, like Knockwood, is a book about romantic love and about difficult family relationships. So what I would like to do tonight is just read, I think I will read, there are two poems at the start and the end of the book that I consider the frame of the book, that sort of address the question, what is love, in complex and hopefully thoughtful ways. And then I will read some poems that deal with the sort of family mythology that exists in the book, and then poems that deal with the romantic mythology of the book. I will start with the first poem in the book, which is called Agape Feast. An Agape Feast, as I'm sure some of you know, is a love feast or a shared communal feast. And this poem does literally begin with the sort of answering of the question, what is love? Agape Feast. What is love but the bruise or the abrasion, the fruitlessness, the deep incision? What is love if it isn't on stage or placed between two sonnets' turns? What is love nerving down the spine? Just now I thought I felt it stir or heard it, like the wall's small nest of baby mice, like chemicals set to preserve imported furs. Its complaint got in, rain astringent at its end, fat as a blackberry, thin as a stick, stationed overseas at the vein itch or artery strap. Bubble, flutter of pain, an emptiness pinned to its lapel. It is an aftermath at best. Shh is what it says. Dear, diagram yourself. Its pigeons shuttle like the imbalance of a hat, pores seen, lips curled. It is not the documents correct. Stamps are streaked away with bleach, bags are searched, the fingers of government workers black with ink. Its ribs grate like gnashed teeth. It sings like the polished floor of a bank. It reads all the lines in your palm as the equivalent of death, carrier of diseases and lice, wool blanket stink, fire beneath the bridge. Its past is a chasm, its past is a lid. Let it catch at the latch of your throat and body bag your want and infinity your need. Its Jesus is the noose at your neck. Its Jesus is the blue slits veins seam at your wrist. Its mercy is electric. It is storied. It is rank. Its mercy is a tablet dissolved in a glass, more invisible the more you drink. So there are 5 sibling poems in the book. And then the goal of the sibling poems is to take the relationship that a sibling may have. I mean, we grow up with our siblings and we live close to them. And I think when we become estranged from them at some point, it can be really painful. So these 5 poems investigate different ways of framing the sibling in different situations where there's sort of an investigation of that relationship as siblings who were young together become adults. So there are poems like Sibling Frankenstein and Sibling Invention and Sibling Bipolar. And tonight I will read Sibling Medusa. In the pictures, the hair snakes all look the same, though I know better. Every snake is a different persona, though all are out for murder. Every hiss is a criticism unfettered. Every head is a hatred on its leash. Every slither is a movement toward hurting me further, like our mother. I learned long ago to only approach you from the mirror. Your scales overlap. They have the phalanx of your heart. All my shields crumble. All my winged shoes fail. You are my sister. My love for you is a ladder. I climb until I fall. There is a Red Sea in my blood, and it is your mood, venomous at root, ever changing as a god. There is a Red Sea in my blood, and I must keep it still, as its tides would drown us, as our parents still hope we will break bread. We believed you were a priestess. We put you on the urns. We lifted you up and loved you alone. Now you are a monster and want me gone. Were I to carry it as a weapon, your head would turn on me. I am only one of the statues that surround your lair. All of our family is there, posed and still, paralyzed by your punishment, your scathe, your skill. Where I had my home, I am no longer at home. I was closest. I was in your crib. I was in your bed. I wore your clothes. I shared your name. Is this why you hate me? Is this why I now see the deadly inside red of 1,000 stretched open mouths? Your serpents control me. Your eyes are voiced over. I don't know you. Where is my sister? So to keep in the family vein for a bit, I think I will read 2 more of these family poems. I think the next poem I'll read is Job's Comfort. So Those of you who know the story of Job will know that when Job lost everything, those who went to comfort him grew impatient with his struggle and eventually simply added to his distress. I think this is something that during these days when there is so much of a need for understanding and empathy, and we are all struggling, we can sort of understand, right? It's very easy to allow someone the space to suffer and then to sort of withdraw that support, perhaps again unintentionally. But Job's comfort is a comfort that ends up being reproof rather than consolation. So this poem is called Job's Comfort. And this is, I'll just frame this and the next poem as poems that deal with the mother figure in the book. And she is at the center of the book and is sort of the subject of the title poem for the book. So this is Job's Comfort. Once you were a god I could feel enter the house from my room. Once I knew to shut the door when you returned. Once my muscles tensed in anticipation of the moment you came and rained your anger down. My sister and I cringed. We'd hear the car pull in, snap the television off, and run. But there was no escaping the key in the lock, the door swung back, the sound of your heels crossing the floor. We were soft-bodied in our shells. We hunched quiet as the corners where we crouched. We split up to decrease the risk. We would sacrifice ourselves for one another. Except I remember the night you pulled her from bed and set her before our father to accuse him. How she must have stood in the living room while you screamed, head down, fists clenched, although I couldn't see. I was huddled fearful in my bed. All I could think was, I was glad it wasn't me. So the next poem, and it's interesting because as I'm sort of reading from this book and beginning to understand what it looks like from almost an external point of view, I'm starting to realize that there are a lot of two things. There are a lot of poems that make reference to religion and mythology, which are things that I think my work has always done to some extent. But also there's a lot of extended metaphor poems. And I really do like when a poem has a sort of long comparison down the page between two things. And so this next poem, if you are familiar with the tarantula hawk wasp, which you may be, you will know that it is that wasp that lands on tarantulas and paralyzes them. So it stings the tarantula to paralyze it. Then it drags it to its burrow and buries it. And it then lays a single egg on the abdomen of the tarantula. And so the tarantula is paralyzed, but is alive when that larvae is born and the tarantula serves as its food source. So it is really in nature kind of one of the most horrific examples of what we would consider cruelty between animals, though of course for animals it's simply survival. But it's a really interesting, it has always struck me as a really interesting potential metaphor. And so this poem uses that wasp as the source of the metaphor and kind of calls attention to the sort of cyclical nature of this relationship between the wasp and the tarantula, and how every death results in a birth, and then every birth results in a new death. So this is called My Mother is the Wasp Egg Attached to the Belly of the Tarantula. Soon to hatch, soon to unlatch and crawl inside, soon to liquefy and siphon the guts. It seems too much to start with the tissue, then gorge organs out, to be buried with an insect, then turn it to a corpse. Larvae suck until the final molt. The more she is flesh, the more he is husk, but the venom does its work. The spider is still, eye twitch, limb twitch, paralysis lair. How she grows to gain the most painful sting, gains coloring that declares her unfit to eat. Eposomatic blue-black with molasses amber wings, takes flight to ignite another round of this. She finds you by the smell, flips you over, stabs the soft joint of the leg, lands on you, probes your belly, seals the chamber, closes the grave, leaves me unborn, voracious, ready to wake. So the one thing that I'll just mention as a way of kind of talking about the way that this book sort of thinks about the cycle that happens, especially between mothers and daughters, as they are not only impacted by one another, but also by the cultural frames that are set up for women, and that women sort of lead other women to engage with and follow and fall into. So the title poem for the book, The Pact, it's sort of an unwieldy, crazy, large poem that I won't read because it is a little bit big, but you can find it online if you're interested. And it does sort of address the fact that the mother destroys the daughter, even as the daughter destroys the mother, and there's a sort of acknowledgement of that mutual destruction. And then by the end of the poem, there's an acknowledgement that the sort of larger culture has, of course, been responsible for destroying them both and has led them to this place. So I will just read maybe two of the romantic love poems. So the book is set up so that the poems that deal with family mythology are sort of split up by shorter sections that deal with the romantic love. And of course, again, suggesting that one makes room for the other, that all of the things that we go through in our families lead us to love others outside of our families in certain ways and lead to certain patterns that we may not even be aware of. And again, how those are not always completely positive, right? We all have our bits of baggage that we carry with us. So the first of these that I'll read is "The punishment of one is the love song of another." And this really could be sort of the thesis statement of the book, this title, right? We love, and sometimes it is healthy and sometimes it is not. And we all define our own sense of what's healthy and what works for us, and how we love and how we need to be loved. I also wrote this poem in Penn Station at like 4 o'clock in the morning. Not that that means anything. It's just something I think of when I see it or read it. At last I have found my assassin. At last I have struck gold. When my past hissed with cobras, you let me sleep. When I was falling, you brought the ground closer and made gravity of flowers like a kiss. One body moving is a seduction. One body is a practiced leap and a parachute unsprung. Only the scalpel knows the passion of blood. We soothe it with cold and sing it to sleep. We leap at the chance to be blistered. We listen and stiffen, we pivot and reap. My rib cage could be a wasp nest built of paper. My hand could be the slip of sand across itself to slake the great unknown. Snow coughs along the windows now and listens differently to the pure. Snow brocades like cotton, prayers like burdens go. So in another of these extended metaphor poems, I talk about Jonestown and the situation that happened in Jonestown. So Jonestown is really interesting because I think when we think about it, we have, again, sort of culturally framed it in a particular way. We talk about it as a village where people died willingly and they all died together and they drank the Kool-Aid, and we sort of have that saying, we drink the Kool-Aid. And there's really just a sense of them as, kind of crazy people who did this thing together. And that allows us really, I think, to step away from any sense of responsibility or involvement, to put the people in Jonestown in a place that is separate from our own experience. But when you start to do research into what happened there, you realize that the degree of manipulation and in some cases sort of force are really more at play than one would expect. So 909 people died there. Many of them were children. When you read about it, they say that when there was a sense that it was time, right? It was time to commit this great act. And when people started to get antsy about it or question it, the people in charge actually murdered their children. So the children were either made to drink the Kool-Aid or injected with poison. And that was one of the reasons that a lot of adults then moved forward and took part, because this had happened to the children. Jim Jones had them sign compromises with a capital C, where they were putting their signature on a piece of paper without knowing what it said. So he would use those to sort of force people who wanted to leave into staying, saying, you've signed this document, you have no freedom. And also they had white nights that happened, and these white nights were practice suicide events. So they would drink the Kool-Aid, the alarms would go off, they would drink the Kool-Aid, and then they wouldn't die. So this happened so many times, but that by the end, no one knew what was going on. No one knew what was happening. And many of the people who weren't willing to take their own lives were killed by force. And so I'm going to read this poem. It is called If Our Love Were Jonestown. And obviously it uses that complexity of involvement and, who has the responsibility for what level of emotional involvement. And there is one quote in here that I think you'll be able to recognize that comes directly from Jim Jones in response to the white nights and the drinking of the Kool-Aid. So this is If Our Love Were Jonestown. We would sign our compromises, not knowing what they say, and in this way pledge to stay, and in this way create a cult for two. We would give up all we want and are, emptied syringes surrounding buckets of drink. The unwilling in us would be injected with poison or shot. The promise of joy would lead us. There'd be a house at the head of the hive of houses telling us what we thought. Children would emerge from the jungle with jungle in their eyes wide and hands crusted with dirt. Children would disappear into the jungle, their lips stained. We would rest beneath the churned up soil, among the empty cigarette packs, among animal bones, an arrowhead, torn carpet, and damaged tile. Love would be 12 miles long and 7 miles wide, the size of something that could have been real and turned out to be a lie. Our white nights would be so white, none of us would get out alive. We'd endanger ourselves with what we believe, with how we follow. What we feel is our leader and the real paranoia. All the drills will have us thinking we'll live through it, but we won't in the end. Now I know I can trust you, my darlings. Go now, sleep tight. Tight is how we'll sleep, our breath in our chests, nothing let out. They'll come around with stethoscopes to be sure we are dead. If we are not, we are shot. But we are them. We kill the children inside us first, and this is why we die. We want to belong. We perfect believing. We perfect trust until it kills the children, until it kills us. And I think I will just end with the last poem in the book, which completes that frame. And then we can talk a little bit via questions in the chat. And of course, we can talk more after if you'd like. So this is Ode to Love. It is the last poem, as I said. It's interesting because one of the things I always think about is how when a line or a refrain is repeated throughout a particular poem, the nature of what happens in between each of its occurrences changes the nature of that line, right? And this is why we can have refrains. This is why things can be repeated and yet change, right? So like death is the mother of beauty, or any one of those amazing refrains that happen in poems. And I think throughout this book, ideally that definition or sense of what love is changes. And so when there is a poem about the nature of love in the beginning of the book, hopefully by the time you get to the second poem about the nature of love, it is a very different nature of love that you're coming up against. And so this is the second end cap to the book's frame. In this poem, love is an avocado pit. It's a nuclear testing site, and it is a stocked pond. So you will hear those references in the poem. And, you know, stocked ponds are weird, aren't they? Because they're, you know, potentially natural, but also not natural. And they just put all that stuff in there for you to catch that wouldn't be there otherwise. So this is Ode to Love. Place its toothpicked pit in water. Watch the grist of its insides grow. Witness its populous bloom, honeycombed with rough. Its cobblestones grip the heart in their mitt, a closed fist thickened and gritty as silt. The swamp of the plum beet adamant as weeds, the dish of which is salted by complexities or cries. It is a house in which we cannot live, the quiver on an arrow we cannot launch. It grows late over Nevada as we watch, strikes its gullies, we grow burnt as a moth, mimics a sleep of archives and the small lies we forget, mimics all laughter broken by the time it leaves the mouth. With its moving parts, its chimes, its gleam, it muddies our archways lying low, gives off noise and steam, its mechanics clear the fence. It must be wooed, must be quieted, hush. It must be soothed, has a snag, has a bleed, a drape, flaps awkwardly at its edges, a heron. At its center, a wide bottom perfect with fish. Thank you. Okay, so why don't we do some fun Q&A time? So it looks like I have a question from Jimmy Pappas. Hi, Jimmy. Question. I am fascinated by the poem and was wondering if you could tell me anything about the title. Okay, thank you, Jimmy. So yes, apparently the book, jumped out into the world a little bit prematurely for some people. So you may have a copy that arrived a few days in advance. Obviously, you are one of those people. So Anne is such a kind of crazy poem. There were some of the poems in the book that were written. This book sort of happened in a few different phases for me, and there was this very intensive time when I was writing these sort of intense, obsessive love poems. And so Chemistry is one of those, which is sort of a twisted poem about dating. And is one of those. There's a poem called The Pledge, which is basically like, I don't know, sadistic. I would give up everything for you in really weird ways. And is a poem about sort of giving to the point of extremity. And so, and being taken from to the point of extremity. And so the ampersand sort of represents that connection. Ampersands are so weird, aren't they? They are and they are a joining of two things through that but also they're so twisted in on themselves, aren't they? They're like, I don't know, they're like codependent pretzels or something. When you look at them, they look like they're hunched over and they're confused and they're not, they don't feel like a healthy connection. They're really interesting. They're really beautiful. I like them. And so that is why this poem is titled with an ampersand, because it is a poem. I mean, it starts with this addressed darling. You are my boxed in place, my razor blade, my vinegar state, right? None of those are the most positive things. But yeah, that's why, because ampersands look like unhealthy love to me in some ways, unhealthy connection. Thank you. So another question, has writing poetry taught you anything about yourself? Yes, poetry has taught me all I know about myself. I mean, being a person is really weird. I think being a person is kind of hiding from yourself. Like that's the very definition of being a person. So I think until I write, I don't know anything. And then I start to go, oh my goodness. And it's interesting because I've had people say to me, how can you have the personality that you have, which is hopefully, I guess what they meant was like, I'm a really fairly happy-ish person and write the poems that you write. So, but which is my true self. I think my whole last book of poetry was a book of persona poems. So I understand that there is a self underneath the self in every single person. So every time I write a poem, I discover things about myself, whether I want to or not. So thank you for asking. Hi, Rev. What made me relate love to Jonestown? So the interesting thing about Jonestown, and I think relationships potentially at times do this as well, is that Jim Jones took both the natural tendency to trust and the natural desire to find joy in connection with others, both of which are really inherent to our humanity and our existence, and twisted them. And this is what emotional manipulation is, right? So this was supposed to be a sort of utopia, and it was supposed to be a place where these people connected and they trusted so completely and fully and positively in the name of something good that they changed the world. And instead, that trust was taken and twisted like an ampersand and made into something really different. And so I think this is what a cult is. And sometimes this is potentially what a relationship can be. So any intense love is going to have that edge to it, whether it ends up being okay or not. I hope that answers your question. Hi S, can you tell us your thoughts on sound in your poems? How much does it figure in your process? Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking at a reading a couple of days ago about how I have seen my poems change from book to book, right? And Louise Gluck was someone who talked in an essay about trying to do something different consciously for every book in the poems that were in each book. So I'm going to write a new book, so I'm going to try and do this or try and do that. And I don't consciously make that decision, but I think one of the things that has happened as my poems have evolved is that I have come to rely even more on sound. I've always been a sonically focused poet, but this book, it doesn't apologize at all for doing a lot of really heavy-handed music, a lot of rhyming, a lot of returns to repeated sounds. But I would say sound guides my poems potentially more than almost anything else. And I think what happens is I'm always attempting to make leaps and do something unusual that will sort of reinvent the nature of the comparison or the equation, whatever is involved in the comparison. And following sound often lets me do that. So if I follow sound and let the sound drive the poem, then I will often go to places that I wouldn't go if I were following a more traditional sense of meaning. So it's a little bit of a device for me in that way. Thank you for asking. Diane, when writing something so personal or autobiographical, is there a challenge not to edit yourself? Aware of the possible reaction of those who might have inspired the writing? Yeah, that's a really good question. It's really interesting because I had not been a writer of things that were based in my own life quite so dramatically. And then obviously Knockwood and this book are different that way. And so for the first time, especially with a book that's labeled as a nonfiction book, I've had to confront this aspect of things. And I think there are different ways to think about it. And I think there are a lot of, especially nonfiction writers, I mean, if you talk to them, a lot of them are very comfortable with saying the writing is important to do and it takes priority. But I have been very conscious of that, and it has definitely been a struggle. And it's interesting because when I'm writing on the page, the page feels so private to me. So I feel like I'm just having a conversation with myself and the kind of imaginary reader, and I'm sort of working through some of these things that I'm thinking about. And then all of a sudden these poems are out in the world. And actually I didn't published, this book was finished for a long time before I sent it to my publisher. So I almost thought I can't publish this book. But also there's so much mythology in there, right? I mean, if we think about someone like Plath, who took the stories of the self and created a mythology of self with them, what is true and what is fiction? I think even when a poem ideally is based on true events, it is a sphere or room of mythology, and you are stepping outside of those actual events in order to say something larger. So you are reshaping it. So there's no, there's nothing that's probably exactly true there. Though yeah, you're right. It's a little scary sometimes. I'll admit that. Thank you so much, Diane. Any other last questions?
So we have time for, if you have any final questions, now is the time to send them in. But Jennifer, you have a Zoom meeting where you would be happy to see people face to face. One of the things I miss the most about in-person events is that there is no longer a signing line where people can say, I really loved this and let me just make this comment to you, and to ask questions and have that connective moment. So this is a bit of an experiment. This is pretty exciting that you're going to be hosting this. The Zoom link is in the chat sidebar. So copy paste that to save that, because once we close this out, you'll need to have this link in order to join the meeting. But if there are no other questions, I would like to thank all of you very much for joining us this evening as Jennifer pre-launches the Pact, which is available from Gibson's Bookstore, as is Knockwood. We're very excited to see it out in the world. And thank you very much, everybody who joined us this evening. Jennifer, congratulations on your new book of verse.
Thank you so much. Thanks. And I guess I would just say that, I did create this room as a way to have people have the opportunity to do a signing as well. So feel free to stop in. I have book plates that I will sign. You can privately give me your address in the chat, and I will mail your book plate off to you if you would so desire. So I look forward to seeing a few of you there. And thank you everyone for being here. And thanks so much, Gibson's, for hosting.
Have a great night.
Good night.